Le capitalisme engendre une dynamique permanente d'accumulation, de crise et d'innovation.
I believe that open markets and free enterprise are the best imaginable force for improving human wealth and happiness.
Je pense que les forces sociales et politiques sont les forces centrales dans la dynamique du capitalisme.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism?
Is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
How would Smith see the economic world around us?
I think Keynes would have said the problem is the hole in the economy.
Hayek really wrote The Road to Serfdom as a warning.
You always have to be careful with Marx about the one-liners.
Polanyi, for me, was an intellectual earthquake.
I mean, if I had to stereotype Ricardo, I would say he would look like George Soros.
Si vous retournez chez Adam Smith, Marx, Schumpeter, vous avez des embryons de mécanismes vous permettant de comprendre la crise actuelle.
We were told that capitalism is the product of big thinkers and big ideas. But is it true? How did ideas shape our lives? What is their relation to reality? Can they help us understand today's economic crisis, let alone the future of capitalism?
Lord Keynes, welcome, sir. It's a pleasure.
The pleasure's all mine. Tell them I've arrived.
And then tell them I've arrived.
Hayek versus Keynes. It was described as a debate that shaped the economic thinking of an entire century. It was even made into a music video after the 2008 financial collapse.
Freddie.
Yep.
Keynes. Hey, listen, party at the Fed.
Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek was going to debate British economist John Maynard Keynes on how to extricate societies from the severe depression of the 30s, capitalism's worst crisis.
We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it. Blame low interest rates. No, it's the animal spirit.
Of course, Hayek was on the losing end of the argument. And the notion that he had that public expenditure could not reduce unemployment was considered to be definitively refuted.
Since the crash of 2008, the debate is with us again.
We are on the road to serfdom. Friedrich Hayek wrote this book 50 years ago, but what he predicted is coming true.
In Hayek's name, a rebellion against government's involvement in the economy sprang up in the United States. In Europe, Hayek is the enemy for these anti-austerity demonstrators rebelling against market rule of society. This is the story of how and why the debate which seemed to be resolved in the 30s has resurfaced time and time again.
We've come to Freiburg in West Germany, where I'm going to be talking to Professor Friedrich von Hayek. Professor Hayek, I'm sure you'll be well aware that to many people in Britain, and particularly on the left, you are a kind of bogeyman. You are believed to want to throw people out of work, send children down the coal mines again, grind the faces of the poor in general. I don't suppose you share that view of yourself.
Well, naturally, I don't share it, but I must say I understand it. If you tell somebody that his past has led him to the morass, to withdraw may be even more painful than to go on where you are.
Friedrich Hayek was born in Vienna in 1899, and at that time, Vienna was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Early in his life, He served in World War I as a teenager in the Austrian army, and it was in fact through his experiences in the Austrian army during World War I that he first became exposed to ideas of economics and of nationalism in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Dear Mother, here I am again, in a spotter's position in a foxhole, euphemistically called Hero's Hole. It is mostly wet, cramped, and disgusting, but at least bulletproof. We are under constant aerial attack, not of Italian or British planes, but by horseflies and mosquitoes, with their ground support troops of bedbugs and lice. Friedrich Hayek, a letter from the front.
As a young idealist who'd witnessed so much chaos, who'd witnessed war, who'd witnessed political disintegration of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, Hayek became interested in issues of social organization. After the war, when he returned to Vienna, he enrolled at the University of Vienna, which in the immediate post-World War I era had many scholars from throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire who returned to Vienna and returned to the University of Vienna.
The University of Vienna came to be known as the home of the Austrian School of Economics, which broke from dominant economic theories and methods of the time.
The difference with the classical economics was that they were not dealing with large social entities, classes, but they were dealing with individuals, the decisions of individuals acting in a market. So we are in a world that is entirely individualized in the sense of individual consumers, individual producers considered like independent, freestanding little firms. It was an extreme individualism. Really, I think it is a class issue. It was the utter fear of Bolshevism. The Russian Revolution made a huge impact in Europe. It utterly terrified the propertied classes across the continent. And the language that was used, the dictatorship of the proletariat, it sounded utterly frightening.
Hayek originally had views that were moderately socialist. He thought that there was a very large role for government to play in society in directing economic activity. However, after he graduated from the University of Vienna, he began to take classes and work for Ludwig von Mises, who was a great Austrian economist, who really persuaded Hayek that the problem with socialism wasn't that socialism would be undesirable if it were feasible, but that practically socialism is not possible.
The idea of socialism was always connected with a firm conviction that there is only one good plan possible and that only one plan ought to be put into practice.
Mises really developed these arguments in his socialist calculation debate, where he tried to argue against socialism, that simply without a profit and price and property system, that you really can't have any sort of rational valuation or calculation in economics, and therefore rational economic activity becomes impossible. Hayek really resonated with these arguments and then extended and applied them in his own work.
60-second adventures in economics. An economy is a tricky thing to control, and governments are always trying to figure out how to do it. Back in 1776, economist Adam Smith shocked everyone by saying that what governments should actually do is just leave people alone to buy and sell freely among themselves. In this case, everyone's happy. Later free marketeers, like Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek, argued that this hands-off approach actually works better than any kind of central plan.
The essential idea of Mises and Hayek was that prices are necessary to guide production. There's no substitute for a price system because prices provide the relative value of all goods in society. Mises gave the example of building a house. He said that a house can be built of wood, it can be built of concrete, it can be built of steel, you can use brick, you can use glass. How much of each one of those products should you use in the building? And without a rational standard, which prices provide, it's very difficult to come up with what the appropriate way to build a house is the most economically.
Well, the whole order of international cooperation has been built on such a signaling system.
And these signals, you mean, are the prices in a free market?
Entirely the price in the free market, which alone have made the present level of wealth possible.
Isn't it a philosophy based essentially on selfishness? What about altruism? Where does that come in?
It doesn't come in. See, both altruism and solidarity are very strong instincts which guided man in the small group where he was serving known other persons, when his efforts were directed to the needs of familiar people.
In the attempt to justify and rationalize this economic network, which is what they were all doing, was to say that it was rooted in the human mind. The brain was built that way, and this was rational action, and that any other kind of economics or economic system would either get hopelessly entangled without the lead of prices, or it would just be irrational. Capitalism, in short, was to be an eternal economic system because it was the most rational, the most efficient, and the fairest in terms of rewarding people's contributions.
If Hayek's ideas were forged out of the chaos of the First World War, John Maynard Keynes came of age intellectually in this house in Charleston, England. It is here where the young Keynes underwent a transformation, rebelling against his rigid schooling in the all-male, prestigious Eton boarding school.
Keynes was the product of a late Victorian, comfortable academic family in Cambridge, England. He was raised and educated in the company of philosophers and mathematicians.
Keynes belonged to the Bloomsbury Group, and the Bloomsbury Group was a cultural coterie of intellectuals and artists. They were part of the fin de siècle revolt against the Victorian. You had this revolt in art, in literature, and in philosophy. And it was just basically saying a new age has dawned, and we're part of that. It was also an age of sexual liberation. They abandoned the conventions of marriage, and there was a lot of homosexuality, and Keynes was involved in that as a young man, too.
Keynes became absorbed in economic policy, primarily of the First World War, emerging at the end to be an advisor to the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, at the Paris Peace Conference, led to the Treaty of Versailles.
Greatest headlines of the century. The
Versailles Palace was the scene of much feverish activity on the part of Allied statesmen. Woodrow Wilson from the U.S., Georges Clemenceau of France, Lloyd George of England, and Premier Orlando of Italy represented the four major powers at the conference. Months of argument had achieved a final treaty that was offered without discussion to the German delegation headed by Count Brockdorff-Rantzau.
A deeply embittering, disillusioning experience, which led to, of course, this very remarkable book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in 1919.
Which is probably the first book of economics that became a bestseller, a world bestseller. And he denounced the treaty, and he predicted that unless it was revised, vengeance shall not limp.
Once again, the world was at peace, a peace that was destined to last for but 20 years before the same defeated country of Germany would again plunge the earth into a second Great War.
He said that these debts that the Allies are imposing on Germany will never be collected. He said such tributes cannot be maintained for year after year after year. It's against human nature, it's against social nature. And he was right. I think he thought that bad economics would lead to bad politics, and that you had to have an economics that was consistent with maintaining social cohesion and political stability. And if your economic theories led you to ignore those two things, then you would get into terrible political and social trouble.
But such a mixing of politics and social observation with economics was alien to Hayek and the Austrian School of Economics.
Chez Hayek, effectivement, on ne prend absolument pas en compte le phénomène des réparations et des circuits de la dette entre les divers pays belligérants, les États-Unis, après la Première Guerre mondiale. C'est le mérite de Keynes d'avoir illustré que ceci était un mécanisme impossible. Mais il est assez normal que Hayek ne l'ait pas détecté parce que dans sa théorie, à l'extrême rigueur, le taux d'intérêt jouait un rôle dans la processus de capital, mais le crédit en lui-même n'était pas traité.
Had Hayek gone back to the Versailles Treaty, he would have discovered that the speculative bubble that burst in 1929 and triggered the Depression had its roots in America's decision to insist on getting paid for the money it had loaned to its allies during the war.
The Allies turned to Germany and said, you have to pay us enough money to pay the United States for the debts that we took in defeating you. And under the Versailles Treaty, Germany's debt was infinite. There was no limit to the debt.
A circle of loan payments was created. It necessitated keeping interest rates artificially low so countries would not default under debt. Investors seeking higher returns flocked to the stock market.
Soaring out into the wild blue yonder, stocks hit what looks like a permanently high plateau. But conditions are fundamentally sound, aren't they?
On s'aperçoit que la différence entre Keynes et Hayek, c'est que Keynes s'intéressait beaucoup au marché boursier, observait l'économie. Il observait l'économie et voulait la théoriser. Hayek voulait une théorie normative de l'économie. Et donc, les phénomènes qui ne rentraient pas dans la théorie, il ne les observait pas.
Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, in history's worst panic, over 16 million shares have dumped on the market as stocks go down, down, down. Hallelujah.
In 1929, the stock market collapsed. Free market capitalism was in crisis, perhaps the gravest in its history.
It's over. All over.
Once I lived a life of a millionaire. Spending my money, I didn't care.
Unemployment in many countries was over 25%. U.S. industrial production fell by 50%. In some countries in Europe, even higher. Economists were at a loss over how to halt and reverse the decline.
I didn't have a friend
In 1931, Hayek was invited to give a series of lectures at the London School of Economics by Lionel Robbins. They were among the most successful series of lectures that the economists in England had ever heard. They seemed to give an answer to what was wrong with the Great Depression.
Lionel Robbins, who is professor of economics at the LSE, wanted to boost the LSE as against Cambridge. So he thought, here, let's bring this bright young man to the LSE, where he'll challenge the dominance of Cambridge, because Cambridge, by this time, was the premier centre of academic economics in Britain.
So this is how the so-called debate of the century began, with a rivalry between schools of economics. A younger LSE, London School of Economics, against the older, more established Cambridge, a university which was under the spell of John Maynard Keynes, probably the best-known British economist at the time.
The big crash. We didn't bounce back. Economies in the
Having predicted the crisis more than 10 years earlier, Keynes had to offer a solution.
That's outrageous. I had a real plan. Any fool can understand.
Keynes' central thesis was that the level of employment depends on aggregate demand in the economy, basically on the total spending power in the economy.
A live fast, die young kind of chap called John Maynard Keynes cheerfully pointed out that, in the long run, we're all dead. So to avoid the misery of unemployment, the government should instead spend money to create jobs. Whereas if the government tightens its belt when people and businesses are doing the same, less is spent, so unemployment gets even worse.
When everyone else is trying to increase their saving, if governments then decide they've got to reduce their spending, that simply aggravates the fall in total spending in the economy and makes the slump worse than it should be.
Hayek's view was that there had been too much capital production. Because interest rates had been kept artificially low by the Federal Reserve Board in the United States, this had encouraged too much capital development. The capital development was unsustainable. And for that reason, the appropriate course for the economy and for government to follow was basically a hands-off policy and allow the economic downturn to play itself out and for the bad investments to be liquidated.
While he was in London, Hayek's ideas were put to the test in Germany.
Ja, es ist sehr bedauerlich, gerade in Deutschland, dass die Erfahrungen aus den frühen 30er Jahren überhaupt keine Rolle in unserer Diskussion spielen. Wir haben ja mit dem Reichskanzler Brüning in der Tat einen Politiker gehabt, der versucht hat, in einer extremen Rezession, Depression, das Haushaltsdefizit möglichst klein zu halten.
Germany, which is putting all her energies to the gigantic task of setting their house in order by hard work and sound economy, will feel encouraged in a heroic struggle for reconstruction and stability.
Und Brüning hat das geschafft. Das ist sehr eindrucksvoll. Brüning hat wirklich so stark gespart, dass in dieser Phase der extremen Depression das Deutsche Reich kaum ein Defizit gemacht hat. Aber der Preis war natürlich katastrophal. Es war ein massiver Einbruch der Wirtschaftstätigkeit. Es war ein Preisverfall, eine breite Deflation und ein extremer Anstieg der Arbeitslosigkeit, der dann in Deutschland zu all den schrecklichen politischen Folgen geführt hat, unter denen die ganze Welt dann doch sehr zu leiden hatte.
Vengeance should not limp, said Keynes in his book. His warning about ignoring the social costs of economic decisions materialized in Germany's 1932 electoral campaign.
13 Jahre lang haben Sie wirtschaftlich, politisch bewiesen, was zu leisten Sie fähig sind. Eine Nation wirtschaftlich zerstört,
den Bauernstand ruiniert, den Mittelstand verelendet, die Finanzen in reichen Ländern, in den Kommunen zerrüttet, alles bankrott und 7 Millionen Arbeitslose. Sie können sich finden, wie sie sich finden wollen. Dafür sind Sie verantwortlich.
So Hayek's ideas seem to have failed the test of historical reality, a fact now acknowledged even by his supporters.
I had an interview with Milton Friedman, and he commented to me, he said, I could never understand why all those folks at the London School of Economics were so impressed by Hayek's lectures there. So in retrospect, it's something of a mystery.
By the end of the war, Hayek was forgotten, his ideas marginalized. Keynes' message and ideas appealed to a world where public and private sectors tried jointly to rebuild out of the ruins.
Japan lost the war in 1945. The entire nation was devastated, and we needed to reconstruct the nation. Naturally, in the new world, the private corporations also need to help Japanese country.
You could imagine yourself at Earl's Court if you wandered into the New York Motor Show. There were so many British cars there. A great thing for the export trade. The Japanese section attracted a lot of interest. Exports are as vital to them as to our own country.
To become more strong country and economically, better country, we need to export automobiles so that we can earn the foreign currencies, so that we can import oil, food, and so forth to the country. So that was one of the Toyota's responsibility, being the manufacturer, being able to export our products and earn the foreign currencies.
Dauphine Renault, la plus vivante des 4 places, 115 km à l'heure et seulement 6 litres au 100.
In France, a car company like Renault was nationalized and recruited for the national project of reconstruction. Government was not the enemy of the market, as Hayek argued, but its ally. Capitalism suddenly developed a softer image.
Entre 1950 et 1980, on a en Europe et au Japon une croissance exceptionnellement rapide de l'ordre de 4-5% par an pendant 30 années consécutives. Ça fait maintenant depuis 30 ans, de 1980 à 2010, où on a une croissance dans les pays riches qui ne dépasse pas 1%, 1,5% par an en moyenne. On reste dans cette nostalgie des 30 glorieuses pour un monde où on pensait avoir domestiqué le capitalisme, domestiqué les inégalités. C'était en partie une réalité, mais ça venait aussi du fait que les crises entraînés par les guerres mondiales et par la dépression des années 30, avaient conduit à une remise en cause complète du laisser-faire économique.
As the people of Britain began digging out from among their ruins, they fixed all their energies upon one goal, a post-war society stabler and more equitable than any Britain had ever known.
La puissance publique, à partir de 1945, non seulement a créé des systèmes de sécurité sociale, de protection sociale, mais aussi à mettre en place un système de régulation des marchés financiers, d'entreprises publiques dans de nombreux secteurs, qui de fait ont permis, au moins pendant cette période, de domestiquer le capitalisme, de réduire les inégalités. C'était en partie une illusion lié à ce phénomène de rattrapage, de croissance élevée, mais pas seulement. Ça venait aussi du fait qu'il y avait un compromis politique passé avec le capitalisme qui était différent.
Keynes died in 1946 in a world that accepted his vision. But what happened to Friedrich Hayek and his vision? In 1944, he published this book, a warning against the very world that was taking shape around him.
Hayek really wrote The Road to Serfdom as a wake-up call, or a warning that if this same sort of organization of the economy that existed during World War II were preserved after the war, that it would lead to a dictatorial society.
The root of fascism and Nazism, according to Hayek, was not the economic collapse triggered in part by the unregulated free market, but by precisely the opposite, abandoning the liberal ideas which were at the root of the free market. Regulations and state intervention, he argued, led us to serfdom in the past and would lead us there again. The road away from serfdom led to the pristine Swiss Alps, where his vision, marginalized in the post-war world, was being nurtured.
In 1947, Hayek founded the Mont Pelerin Society, which was named after the mountain in Switzerland where the first meeting of this association met. Essentially, this was a group of international classical economists, academics, political philosophers, journalists, and others, including a young Milton Friedman at that time, who went to Switzerland to talk about these ideas for a week or a 10-day-long session.
Tous les opposants à Keynes ont créé le Mont Pelerin, un laboratoire de réflexion, un think tank, dans lequel ils ont essayé de dire nous luttons contre Keynes. Ils n'ont pas cessé de développer des arguments, d'abord à Chicago, puis au Mont Pelerin, en disant il faut restaurer la logique du libre marché. Et le personnage central, c'est Milton Friedman.
It was a major factor in maintaining a steady stream of influence on ideas. It enabled people who were isolated in their own countries once a year, at least, to get together with people who felt the same way they did, to be in a situation in which they could discuss issues without worrying that somebody was trying to stick a knife in their back.
Hayek est un économiste ésotérique, un économiste pour économistes. Son influence pratique est très 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 faible, alors que celle de Milton Friedman a été tout à fait importante sur cette restauration du monétarisme, restauration du rôle minimal de l'État.
If post-World War Europe was immune to Hayek's vision of self-regulated markets, the United States, with its suspicion of government, was far more responsive. Hayek's fight against Keynes' legacy was taken over by Professor Milton Friedman.
For the immigrants who were welcomed by this statue, America was truly a land of opportunity. Once they arrived, they found, as my parents did, not an easy life, but a very hard life. But for many, there were friends and relatives to help them get started, to help them make a home, get a job, settle down in the new country.
Milton Friedman was born in 1912 in New York, and he was the son of Jewish immigrants to the United States from Hungary, and he grew up somewhat impoverished, not necessarily at the lowest socioeconomic level, but not at all from a well-off background.
There were many rewards for hard work, enterprise, and ability. Life was hard, but opportunity was real. There were few government programs to turn to and nobody expected them. But also, there were few rules and regulations. There were no licenses, no permits, no red tape to restrict them. They found, in fact, a free market, and most of them thrived on it.
He was someone who said the problem is government in all of its spheres. Government is essentially wasteful, government is essentially inefficient, and because of that, we need to allow the market to play more of a role in society, and in particular, to play more of a role in the economy.
Hayek was a refugee from the Old World, without a permanent teaching position in the US. Milton Friedman was American-born, with a large reputable academic institution behind him.
The image of the Chicago school, outside of Chicago, outside of us, is semi-ideological. That the idea is that Milton Friedman wrote Free to Choose and other books which were persuasive tracts in a sense. But in his classes, he never taught anything of that. We got not one message of free to choose or anything. We got how the price system works, how human behavior works in the economic sphere.
As one of the first students of Milton Friedman, I discovered later that among Milton Friedman's students, there were two groups. One group became his disciples for life. The other group were vaccinated and were able to ward off these ideas. I was, of course, in the second group. When we look back at the 19th century, what is striking then, and I have to admit even today, I regret to say, is the sense that the market is the utopia for human existence. Left to itself, it will produce benevolence, a cornucopia of products, a perfect outcome, and moreover, it is self-regulating.
I'm the king of excess. I'm the sultan of sales. I'm the boss of bargains. My credit cards, they never fail. I got a 700-something on my beacon score, which means I don't own a thing and I can buy even more. I'm a buffet-eating, tabloid-reading, lovable guy. I get the best of the best that my money can't buy. It's a wonderful life with my red-headed wife.
L'idée de liberté, elle est grande pour ceux qui ont une grande réserve de richesse ou de crédit. Elle est nulle pour le salarié, le prolétaire ou le pauvre paysan africain. Et on joue sur l'idée de contrats entre égaux. Mais les contrats entre égaux sont des choses assez rares dans le capitalisme.
L'illusion néolibérale n'est pas quelque chose de nouveau, c'est quelque chose qu'on observe déjà au XIXe siècle. Et de ce point de vue-là, la France est un pays intéressant parce que c'est vrai que la France, après la Révolution française, qui est un peu la révolution bourgeoise par excellence, la France vit vraiment dans cet idéal de l'égalité des droits face au marché. Il y a cette illusion que ça suffit pour conduire à l'égalité tout court, c'est-à-dire l'égalité face au marché, avec des systèmes de droits de propriété bien protégés, des marchés aussi concurrentiels et libres que possible. Ça suffit, il n'y a plus rien d'autre à faire et en marche vers une société idéale. Sauf que, en fait, une des grandes leçons du 19e siècle et de la catastrophe qui commence en 1914, c'est que ça ne marche pas. C'est difficile à définir, mais ce qui est certain, c'est qu'en 1913, en France ou en Europe, ce n'est pas raisonnable. On a 70% des patrimoines qui sont détenus et transmis par 1% de la population.
Is he telling us that absolute equality is a mistaken objective?
But libertarians like Milton Friedman draw directly the opposite lesson from history.
When you say that it is wrong for government to intervene in the free enterprise system to do something about inequality, you evoke a model of a free enterprise system which does not exist and has never existed to a significant extent in history or anywhere in the world.
I agree with you that everything called free enterprise is not free enterprise. But I challenge you to find a single example in history at any time of any society where people have been relatively free, and I don't mean merely what you call merely economic freedom. I mean freedom in the full sense. I mean freedom of individuals to pursue their own objectives, their own values, to live their lives. I want you to name me any society in which you've had any large measure of that freedom, where capitalism and free enterprise has not been the predominant mechanism for controlling economic activity.
On s'imagine aujourd'hui qu'il suffit d'avoir des marchés plus libres, plus concurrentiels, pour aboutir à une société harmonieuse et à une répartition des richesses, si ce n'est égalitaire, du moins raisonnable dans cette inégalité. Eh bien non. Il n'y a rien dans cette logique du marché libre et parfaitement concurrentiel qui garantit ça, pour une raison qu'on peut résumer assez simplement, qui est que structurellement, des marchés très libres, concurrentiels, n'empêchent absolument pas le fait que le rendement du capital puisse être de façon permanente supérieur au taux de croissance, ce qui génère presque inévitablement une concentration très très forte des patrimoines.
The lesson from the 19th century was lost as economic stagnation and decay gripped Britain and the United States in the early 70s. The golden years were over. With the economic decay, government involvement in the economy was now seen as an obstacle to growth. Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek were back.
À partir des années 70-80, on voit notamment au Royaume-Uni et aux États-Unis des mouvements politiques qui veulent remettre en cause cette plus forte intervention de l'État dans l'économie. Je pense en grande partie du fait d'une réaction face à un sentiment justement de rattrapage par les perdants de la guerre. C'est-à-dire, on est très marqué dans les années 70 par le fait que l'Allemagne, le Japon, bientôt la France, voire l'Italie sont en train de doubler le Royaume-Uni, rattraper les États-Unis, et des mouvements politiques se mettent à dire ça va pas du tout, c'est l'État-providence nous a ramollis, il faut en revenir à un espèce de capitalisme mythique du 19e siècle sans État qui va enfin redynamiser les entrepreneurs anglo-saxons.
The economic stagnation could have been dealt with through adjustments. But for Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, it was the political opening they'd been waiting for since the seminars in Mont Pelerin.
Keynes died in 1946. I have always regarded it as a tragedy that he did not live another decade. He was the one man who had the standing, the personality, the force of character to persuade his disciples not to carry too far some ideas which were good for the 1930s, but which did not apply in the post-war situation.
La vérité, c'est que ce rattrapage des 30 Glorieuses, dans lequel les pays qui avaient le plus souffert des guerres, Allemagne, France, Japon, Europe continentale, allaient rattraper les États-Unis ou le Royaume-Uni, ce serait produit de toute façon. Donc c'était pas bon, mais politiquement, ça a été utilisé pour remettre en cause l'État-providence.
He won't stop calling, he keeps blowing up my phone. He wants to teach me something, and he won't leave me alone. I tell him there's no use in trying, cause Friedrich Hayek is my guy. And if you wanna get with a girl like me, you got to let go control of the economy. I said if you want.
Suddenly Hayek was cool, even for rebellious teenage girls. It began as a debate between Hayek's rigid understanding of the market and its supposed natural laws, and John Maynard Keynes' flexible approach in tune with the complexities of human reality. "40 years later, the roles were reversed. Keynes' followers were now perceived as adhering to rigid models. Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek were suddenly the champions of freedom and liberation, in tune with reality.
The failure of the Keynesian system, the inflation, return of unemployment, all that, first confirmed my prediction in the strictly economic sphere. At the same time, my studies of politics provided, I believe, answers for many problems which had begun to bother people very seriously. But there is a good reason why I am being rediscovered, so to speak.
Since 1975, we worked under a contract that's seen our job security eroded, our working conditions fall apart, and our money wages held intact while prices of living go up and up, and we are tired of it.
Indeed, there were good reasons why Hayek's ideas were rediscovered. They made sense to business and financial leaders who saw their business interests hurt by inflation and paralyzing labor disputes. Economic activity was down and profits declined.
There was what we call a counter-revolution in economics, ushering in what is now referred to as the neoliberal agenda of deregulation and privatization.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next president of the United States of America, Ronald Reagan!
During the 1980s, both Margaret Thatcher in England and Ronald Reagan in the United States attempted to implement policies that were very influenced, both philosophically and practically, by Hayek and Friedman.
I would like to think that the kind of leadership that I would exercise in Washington is not the kind of leadership that I would pretend that I can solve all the problems I've been discussing here, but that together, you and I can. I would like to take the lead in taking government off the backs of the American people and turning you loose to do what I know you can do.
Her supporters called it her biggest achievement. Others called it her terrible legacy. Margaret Thatcher's battle with the miners was a defining moment not only in British industrial relations, but also in British history.
What we've got is an attempt to substitute the rule of the mob for the rule of law. And it was not succeeding.
The counter-revolution, the so-called neoliberal policies introduced by Thatcher and Reagan early in the 80s, was designed to restore the discipline of capital over labor. And it did, because we now know that median wages and salaries in the United States, in real terms, have not increased since 1980, although productivity has.
La chute du mur en 1989 et la chute du système soviétique en 1990 laissent le capitalisme sans rival et conduit à une nouvelle période de foi démesurée, disons, dans la capacité d'autorégulation d'un système de libre marché, de libre concurrence et une foi sans limite dans le capitalisme privé à générer ses propres règles.
My name is Jordan Belfort. At the tender age of 22, I headed to the only place that befit my high-minded ambition.
Je pense que cette période, un peu folle d'un point de vue idéologique, explique beaucoup des dérèglements financiers des années 90-2000.
And we thought capitalism had finally been tamed after the Second World War.
Dans la nostalgie des 30 Glorieuses, il y a aussi la nostalgie d'un monde où on avait passé un nouveau compromis, mais qui était précaire néanmoins.
Bonjour, pouvez-vous venir avec moi? Je vais vous présenter une petite merveille, la 4 chevaux Renault.
C'est important de comprendre que beaucoup des réductions des inégalités qu'on a eues au XXe siècle ont été causées soit par les guerres, soit par des réactions politiques à la suite des guerres qui se sont faites un peu dans l'urgence. La réduction des inégalités n'est pas la conséquence tranquille du processus démocratique parlementaire.
In their vision of the mythical, untamed capitalism of the 19th century, Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek never discussed the very elements that we now know contributed to its catastrophic destruction: inequality, debt, and speculation.
Milton Friedman followed Ricardo, saying, debt cannot create a problem. And although he called his approach monetarism and said money matters, the reality is that money didn't matter at all in his approach, nor did wealth. You have a kind of tunnel vision that was adopted by the bankers to essentially saying, don't regulate the banks, don't regulate Wall Street, have a deregulated economy, everything will work out because economies tend towards equilibrium.
When the price of an asset rises faster than can be explained by economic fundamentals, it creates a bubble.
Once again, financial bubbles began to grow. Once again, they never featured in economic models and discussions.
John Maynard Keynes, F.A. Hayek, round 2.
So the debate of the 20th century, which was supposed to be over in 1979, was reignited after the bursting of the 2008 financial bubble.
New mustaches.
But is it relevant anymore?
Which way should we choose? More bottom up or more top down? Let's listen to the great six. Keynes and Hayek throwing down.
Je crois que toute la théorie économique contemporaine, sauf les hétérodoxes, les marxistes, etc., est bâtie sur l'idée d'un système tellement rationnel qui ne peut pas aller à la crise. On n'a pas de théorie des cours boursiers, parce que dans la théorie des cours boursiers, il ne devrait pas avoir de bulles. Et pourtant, il y a des bulles qui apparaissent régulièrement. Mais la théorie ne peut pas les formaliser, donc elles sont irrationnelles, donc on ne les met pas dans la théorie. Et voyez à nouveau l'aspect intéressant. Donc vous avez des explosions du crédit spéculatif, vous avez des bulles boursières, mais la théorie dit que ça ne devrait pas exister.
So the debate between Hayek and Keynes might be obscuring today's reality rather than helping to clarify it. Maybe it's time to discover a lesser-known thinker who did talk about debt and money, and whose ideas may be far more relevant to helping us understand our 21st century reality.